Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started here in a minute with our first Friday webinar for April of 2021. It's amazing that we are already in April. And this webinar is on the importance of ensuring science-based fisheries policies here, especially in the United States, where we've been a leader on such policies over the last many years. And the title, Getting Fishy with It, was me trying to be funny. And it would have probably been more appropriate for yesterday being April 1st as opposed to today, April 2nd. However, my bad dad jokes aside, this really is an incredibly important issue for the future of the ocean. And it is one that, as we'll hear later, that our visitors at zoos, aquariums, and museums have responded very well to. They've really, in keeping with that mantra, here from the Ocean Project's research, they've come to expect, trust, and appreciate ways they can help the ocean. And it didn't take much to let them know that weighing in on science-based fisheries policies is a good way to do so. So let's turn to our agenda for today's webinar. And what we're going to do is we've got two special guests with us today. Joe Knight, who's a communications advisor with the Marine Fish Conservation Network, and Melanie Kudra from the Texas State Aquarium. So thank you both for being here today. I'm going to, in the interest of time, I thought it would be helpful for me just to give a little bit of background on both of them so that we can, really get through the presentations and then get to your questions. And so with those questions, if you think of them, please do submit those via the chat function in Zoom. We'll be looking at those and then sharing those back with our participants here at the end of the webinar. But first, Joe Knight is a communication specialist, as mentioned, with the Marine Fish Conservation Network and part of the network's staff during the last MSA reauthorization. So we'll hear about the Magnuson-Stevens Act and how that is likely to be reauthorized. She has more than 20 years of experience working in ocean conservation and communications, and I can testify to that because Joe and I worked together at the Nature Conservancy 20 years ago, which is really scary, isn't it, Joe?
Yes, it is.
Woo. Melanie Kudra is the education engagement specialist on the education team at Texas State Aquarium. I had the privilege of getting to work a little bit with Melanie and her one of her former colleagues down there at Texas State on a fisheries campaign in this pilot project that she's going to talk to you about. Her work focuses on community engagement, and she helped to plan and facilitate this project that we're going to be hearing about today. So with that, I do need to thank the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, as they are the underwriters of the efforts that we are undertaking here in public engagement at the Ocean Project, and including this webinar. Now, before we jump in, I do have one other thing I'd like to do, which is for those of you who've joined us before, I like to know a little bit about where you all are on these issues. So I want to do a quick poll of our participants and see if you could chime in here. Has your aquarium, zoo, or museum ever communicated with your visitor audience about fisheries policies? We know that there's been a lot done on sustainable seafood, but have you ever gotten into the policy portion of that? Portion in seafood, like there's always like bad puns to be made here. I don't think it was just my getting fishy with it. There's a lot of bad pun potential. All right.
Yes.
We'll find a new angle for that one later. We'll cast a line. All right. So let's see. We've got most of our votes in here, and it looks like we're a bit of a mixed crowd. So Melanie, for you to keep in mind later that about a third don't know, a third have done so, and a third say no. Let's end that poll, and let me see if we can go to our next one. So this is basically the same question, but about policymakers. Have you ever talked to your knowledge, again, we can always only ask to the best of your knowledge, has your zoo, aquarium, or museum ever communicated with your state or national policymakers about fishery policy? Okay, well, that's interesting. I think we've got slightly more, Joe, who said they've talked to their policymakers about fisheries policies than the public, but again, looking like a third. So, okay. All right, well, without further ado, let me turn it over to thank you everyone for chiming in. We always just like to know where you are so our speakers can adapt accordingly and we can take that into account in the Q&A. So do put your questions in the chat and now I will turn it over to Joe to talk us, give us a little bit of background. When we say fisheries policies here in the States, what do we mean?
Great, thanks Douglas. And it's great to be with you all here today. As Douglas mentioned, I'm a communications consultant working with the Marine Fish Conservation Network. And just to give you a little context for that, it is a coalition of commercial and recreational fishing associations, regional and national conservation groups, aquaria, chefs, sustainable seafood suppliers, and marine science organizations. So we have very diverse membership, and it leads, I think, to really robust policies coming out. So essentially what I want to do here today is, it sounds like there's varying levels of understanding about federal fisheries policy. So I want to give you a very quick overview. I'll be sort of blowing through this pretty quickly. Actually, I need to start my stopwatch. It's going to be at a pretty top level. So please feel free to ask me more questions in the Q&A, and I'll be happy to dive a little bit further into any of these issues. So next slide would be great. Actually, we can blow past that one too. Next slide. Great, thank you. So essentially, overall message, the current health of US fisheries is pretty good. We have some of the best managed fisheries in the world. These two slides or these two graphs show that basically the stocks that are on overfishing and those that are on the overfish list, majority of them are doing pretty well. It's not perfect. We obviously don't want any fisheries to be experiencing overfishing, and we don't want any of them to be overfished. But for the most part, they're doing pretty well. And for instance, since 2000, 47 stocks have been rebuilt and have come off of that overfish list. And that number has been slowly ticking up over the years. So our fisheries are headed in the right direction for the most part. Next slide. And so there are many reasons why healthy fisheries are important, but one of them is because of our US economy. We fisheries, the commercial and recreational fisheries, as it's shown here, contribute $244 billion to the economy, and they create at least 1.7 million jobs. So both recreational and commercial fisheries are an important part of our US economy and also just important parts of our culture and social coastal communities. Next slide. But there is always room for improvement. Currently, the Magnuson-Stevens Act does not deal with climate change at all. It's a law that was started in 1976, which I'll go into in a minute. And so we need to update it to really include issues about climate change. Our growing understanding of the complexity of ocean ecosystems means that we're sort of catching up in terms of how best to manage our oceans. Historically, we have really looked at single species management, and we're realizing now that we need to take a more holistic approach. So there have been changes over the years to improve our law to reflect that, and more needs to happen. And we can always improve our data collection. We base our decisions about how much fish we can take out of our oceans based on data, and how we collect that data, and how much data we can collect, and making sure it's the best available data is something that we're always working, striving to improve. So next slide. I want to talk just a little bit about the law itself, just to give you some historical background. The Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act is our primary law that governs fisheries in federal waters. So that is 300 to 200 miles off our coast in our exclusive economic zone. The law is named after these two gentlemen. I've got Warren Magnuson and Ted Stevens. And when it was originally passed in 1976, it had nothing to do with fisheries conservation at all. Essentially, at that time, we thought oceans were an endless and abundant source of fishing. And the goal was actually to kick foreign vessels out of US waters. So it established that exclusive economic zone and really promoted the US fishing industry. which worked until, the 80s and 90s, and fish stocks completely crashed. You can go on to the next slide. There's a picture of, sort of the amount of fish that some of these large vessels can catch. And so essentially in about the mid-90s, Ted Stevens led the charge to pass the Sustainable Fisheries Act, which changed the perspective of the law, or changed the focus of the law from that of promoting the US fishing industry to that of conserving US fisheries, which was an important change. Next slide. And the second important reauthorization was in 2006, which you see here is a picture of George Bush signing the law. And the main thing that I want you to take away from this reauthorization is that it really solidified that all management decisions needed to be based in the best available science. Up until this point, science had been an advisory tool, but that fishery managers basically made catch decisions based on what they felt was right. And the law was changed so that those fishery management decisions actually had to follow best available science. So it was a really important change in terms of making sure our fisheries remain healthy. It did some other conservations, or included some other important conservation measures, like putting time limits on rebuilding plans, because some rebuilding fish stocks have been taking 30, 40, 50 years to rebuild. But the main takeaway is that science-based piece was really important. So right now, the law gets reauthorized roughly every 10 years, so we're a little overdue for a reauthorization. And our main message for this reauthorization is that the conservation and science-based changes that we have made so far, they are working, and we want to make sure they continue to work. So our main goal for this reauthorization is to make sure that none of those conservation or science-based measures get rolled back. That's our primary goal with this reauthorization. But as I mentioned, it's also an opportunity to look at it and see if there are opportunities to improve it so that we can meet current and future challenges ahead. So next slide. So yeah, great, perfect. So essentially, I just want to quickly go through these. The network has some main goals for this reauthorization. And again, I'm going to blow through these so you can ask more questions later. But first of all, we want to excuse me, foster vibrant ocean ecosystems. So that's things like protecting habitat, reducing bycatch, improving management of forage fish. Second, we want to improve or support productive and sustainable fisheries. So we want to improve catch accounting and monitoring. And that also includes recreational data, which the law has primarily been focused on commercial fishing, but there's a lot of recreational fishing happening out there. So we want to get a better handle on that catch to make sure it's being included in our fishery management decisions. We want to promote working waterfronts, local economies, and small businesses. This is a key part for the network. We really assure small boat and tribal fishermen have a place at the table. And we want to make sure that all the fishery management processes are public and transparent. And as I mentioned, there is nothing in the law currently about climate change. So we want to make sure we are addressing climate change in terms of making sure fisheries are resilient, but also ensuring that there is some measures in place so that fishery managers can act quickly when there is a climate disaster and fishermen are adversely affected. So next slide. So where are we now with Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization? There has been some movement, and I'm just going to quickly sort of go through what's been happening in the House and Senate. In the House, the chairman of the House Subcommittee on Waters, Oceans, and Wildlife is Jared Huffman. He's from California, and he has been leading the charge on Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization. So he's held a series of listening sessions around the country, essentially like a whistle-stop tour, if you will, for fisheries input. And he's heard from a diverse array of stakeholders, all saying basically the same thing: the law is working. So most people do not want to change the science-based and conservation measures in the law. Climate change was another issue that came up a lot. And there was regional issues that came up from these talks. And from that, he has drafted and released a discussion draft for MSA reauthorization. He released that at the end of last Congress. He's getting comments and feedback. And we are expecting that he will introduce a Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization bill in this Congress. Our expectation is that the bill will cover a lot of our priorities, the goals that I went over before. And how far that bill goes in this Congress depends on a lot of things, but one of them is the House committee chair, so the full committee chair, Raul Grijalva, we're not sure if he's going to make this bill a priority for the full committee, so that will depend or be a big deciding factor as to how far Huffman's bill goes. So as an alternative, there could be some smaller bills that get introduced in the House and move forward that have Magnuson-Stevens related legislation. So in the Senate, Maria Cantwell, she's the chair of the Commerce Science and Transportation. That's where NOAA is housed. So she would be the senator in charge of the committee that would focus on Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization. So far, we have not heard that the Senate plans to move a comprehensive bill forward in the near future. And our expectation is that there may be some MSA related legislation that moves forward as individual bills and then may get grouped together as an ocean package at a later time. So next slide. And feel free to, go ahead and put all this up. So essentially, this is just some policy that we're watching in 2021. I've already mentioned the Magnuson-Stevens Act reauthorization. There's a working waterfronts bill that got introduced last Congress and we expect will be introduced this Congress. That has things like funding for infrastructure. It has a grant program for small fishing businesses. As you know, climate change is a big issue now in Congress and with the new Biden administration. We expect that there will be movement on the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act. And, a lot of what's in this bill and also in the executive order that was released by the Biden administration was how to prepare and adapt fisheries for climate change. And again, to understand how we can make quick movements to allow for responses to climate change. I'll just quickly mention the infrastructure package. There may be some coastal habitat protection and restoration in that. I don't know if there's going to be any more COVID relief packages going forward, but just to flag, there was $255 million in fisheries assistance in the last one. And then finally, 30 by 30 is the initiative I know you all are familiar with, but I just wanted to voice the network supports conservation of essential fish habitat and wildlife habitat. One of the things we're really emphasizing though is that we want to make sure stakeholders, especially small scale fishermen and other small businesses, are really included in the discussions and decision making for where those should go, so that we're not getting rid of fishing grounds that are really sustainable and a source of income for these small scale fisheries. So next slide. So how can you all help? And I know Melanie will go more into this, but from our standpoint, the fact that you can bring the ocean to the public and educate them on ocean conservation is significant. So that is a really big piece for us in terms of seeing you as a critical partner in all of this. Another thing I wanted to bring up is your ability to communicate directly and to give us feedback on what messaging works and what doesn't. I think it's highly beneficial. That's something I've talked with Bill and Douglas about, really understanding the messaging that works and doesn't with the people that come to your aquariums and zoos. And finally, you're a really important messenger to policymakers. You have the credibility as a science and conservation organization, and you also have wide name recognition within your community. So when you speak, people listen, and I think that's really valuable for helping to ensure that fisheries policy really gets the attention it deserves. So with that, I'm a little over time. I'm sorry, Douglas, but I will turn it back over to you and to Melanie.
That's okay. Thank you so much, Joe. And let me just turn it directly over to you, Melanie. Oh, I think you're on mute, Melanie.
I am, sorry about that. Hi everyone, my name is Melanie and I'm joining you from the Texas State Aquarium down in Corpus Christi, Texas. Before we get started with our actual project, I just wanted to give you a little introduction on a little bit of our audience here in Texas. Now, when we were first asked to discuss fisheries policy issues with our audience, we were just a little bit hesitant. Now, we are a coastal community, so many of our visitors visit the coast. I'll show you right now, we are located directly on the water. This is a live shot of the outside of our building right now. But you know, Texans tend a little more conservative, and Texans don't necessarily always love the federal government telling them what to do and interfering. So while we've always had a pretty strong message of choose seafood that's caught in the US Gulf of Mexico, that's where we're located, or if you can't choose seafood that's caught in the US Gulf of Mexico, choose seafood that's caught in US waters. We really hadn't gone further than that into the policy issues, but with the Ocean Project and several partners, we were able to develop that best framework for talking to our guests about policy issues. Because in Texas, we were a little bit nervous and we weren't always so sure that it would be well received, because we are a place where people come to have a great day with their family, and we're a little bit nervous about talking policy and politics, especially when we were doing this project. It was in 2018 and it was a little bit of a contentious political climate, but we teamed up with the aquariums across the country that you see now, and we all developed a common framework. We did a pilot study, and even though we all had our different way of delivering the message, we used these 3 basic points. First, for a common messaging framework, we wanted to choose a local example that our visitors could connect with. For us, we chose the red snapper. Red snapper are a fish that once had incredibly low numbers that crashed, but due to science-based fisheries management, their numbers have increased. And now you'll see red snapper on the menu here in Corpus Christi. And so we wanted to make sure to tell a fisheries management success story to our guests, and that's what we did. And then our ask after that was to ask participants to sign a card to Congress, asking them to keep fisheries policy strong. So every aquarium in this group did it just a little bit differently, but we'll talk a little bit about our methods and how we delivered this message. So for us, our largest captive audience is our dolphins presentation. We do it 3 times a day, and it's definitely the presentation where we see the most people. So we thought this was a great opportunity to deliver that message, first about the red snapper, then about its success story using that management, and then give our ask. So we chose one interpreter to give a pre-show messaging over the microphone. Usually the dolphin show fills up well before the start of the show. So there is that lull time where the stadium is full, but the show hasn't started quite yet. So we chose one interpreter to learn the script and learn that message about the red snapper. He gave that message over a microphone, and then we had staff sort of waiting in the wings with those clipboards that you see on the screen. And they had a letter to members of Congress, and those clipboards just had stacks of these letters so that we could pass them down the aisles, kind of like you pass down a collection plate at church. So you could sign and then pass it to the person next to you. And then there was someone waiting at the other side of the aisle to pick up any cards that were signed. And we did that for 3 dolphin shows for several different days. And we then wanted to evaluate, not just did people sign those cards, but did they receive that message? Did that message impact their experience at the aquarium that day? And even though we were a little bit nervous about talking policy, what we found is that it was a very positive experience for our guests overall. We did not get the pushback that we were a little bit nervous about getting in Texas, having people not wanting to necessarily talk about government and the laws maybe that might impact them. 1 in 4 show attendees did indeed sign a card. So for us, that was an incredible response. And then we did iPad exit surveys. So as guests were exiting, we were able to do a survey that Douglas designed, and then we could ask that important question, did you attend the dolphin show or did you not? So that we could determine which folks in our surveys had received that message. And our exit surveys indicated that guests that were engaged with the message had more support for the fisheries issues than those that did not engage with the message. And they also had a better time at the aquarium. Now, this was helpful for us because we knew now that engaging people with fisheries policy was not going to be so contentious, but it also was helpful because it allowed our CEO then to have data from our own guests to write a letter to the senator and to our local senator in support of a law. So that was pretty incredible that he actually then was able to use the data from our project in his letter to our policymakers. So we really appreciated that. Now, after this project, we always have a few lessons learned. One thing is that we don't need to be afraid to talk policy. Now, we certainly didn't point out any particular lawmakers or anything like that. We didn't use names. We just said fisheries management policy, use science-based fisheries management. So we certainly used very specific language, but we don't need to be afraid to talk about it. Our guests are willing to participate in policy issues. A quarter of the guests that attend the Dolphin Show were willing to actually sign a letter to Congress. So that was incredible. Something that we definitely didn't consider when we started this project, but if we ever did something similar again, we would absolutely want to consider delivering the messaging in Spanish, or perhaps just having a double-sided comment card to Congress, because many of our guests are Spanish speakers. So we want to make that as accessible as possible and hopefully even increase that rate of folks that sign the card and engage with the message. So overall, it was a really, really positive experience for us here in Texas. And we want to encourage other places to do the same thing that we did. For us, it made an awesome day for our guests and a great experience for the interpreters and the staff as well that got to engage with them.
Wow, thanks so much, Melanie. And again, when you say 25% sign a comment card to Congress, it was good for you, that's ridiculous. Like, that's ridiculous for anyone. I mean, we all think of the poor person trying to get signatures in the shopping mall for Greenpeace. And if they got 1 in 4 people in the mall to stop and sign, they would probably like faint from like how excited they were. Well, thank you both. Before we're gonna pull, I'm gonna drop the screen share here in a second so we can go to Q&A. If you're interested, we are at the Ocean Project going to be expanding our effort around public engagement and informing policymakers on fisheries policies. Please email me at the address you see there if you're interested in being part of that. That group's we're just starting to get that going. We have a more established effort that's a little further along on 30 by 30, as many of you know. And then there's now, if you're an AZA member, there's a good AZA group for that. And last but not least, our first Friday webinar will be on the first Friday of next month, 1 p.m. on May 7th. So now let's go to the Q&A, and I'm going to stop sharing so that you can see us a little better. We have a couple of, we have one question in the Q&A and one question in the chat. So let me go to the question in the chat from Al. What actual number of signed cards in relation to 25% of guests signed cards? So what were do you know that, do you have handy, Melanie, the number of guests that actually signed?
I believe it was right at about 1,000. I think it was 999 cards that we had signed. And then we had about 4,000 guests that attended the show. So that's a quarter of the guests that attended the show, not the guests that attended the aquarium that day. It's just those that received that message.
And those were just on, you were testing on limited days. I mean, that was just the days you were doing the exit surveys and running the cards.
Absolutely. It was a pilot study.
Yeah. Okay, good. And there was a question from Riley in the Q&A asking Joe if you could touch on whether or how MFCN is working to help other countries outside the US to implement the fisheries policies that have been successful here.
Yes, thank you. So I was actually typing out my answer, but be much easier. Not a fast typer. So essentially the Marine Fish Conservation Network solely focuses on US federal fisheries policy. And that's essentially because we just want to be streamlined in our approach. But there are a lot of groups that work at the international level. The Ocean Conservancy is just one that comes to mind. I know the Nature Conservancy, where Douglas and I both worked, I think they're still working on international waters. So there are a lot of organizations that are focusing there. But yeah, I mean, reducing bycatch was one thing that was mentioned in the question, and that's an issue across the globe. So, you know, I know that policymakers are always looking to other countries and to see how other countries deal with these issues. And hopefully there's also things that we can share at the US federal fisheries level with other countries as well. So thanks for a question that, you know, going into the international stuff, I can only answer things limitedly, but.
No, that's great. And let me ask for a new person, another question in the chat. For a new person interested in the Ocean Project, can you briefly explain 30 by 30? 30 by 30 was a new national commitment recently signed by President Biden to conserve 30% of US lands, waters, and ocean. We've had to learn to say waters and ocean because apparently sometimes people don't think of the ocean as water, but anyway, lands, waters, and oceans by 2030. And that's scientifically based. For AZA members who maybe were at the 2019 annual meeting, Enrique Sala, who's the explorer in residence at National Geographic, did a really great presentation. He's been kind of the force behind it. And it also will be the conservation action focus for World Ocean Day 2021. And my colleagues at the Ocean Project have put up a really nice toolkit if you want to think about incorporating 30 by 30 into your World Ocean Day activities or events. So there's a little plug. I'm also curious, Joe, I know you mentioned that Representative Huffman has introduced a discussion draft. Can you tell us a little bit more maybe about what's in that and what we should expect? Does it look like it's going to be a good thing?
It does, yeah. So we were pleased to see that most of the conservation priorities that the network is working on were included in the discussion draft. So that means good things for the Magnuson-Stevens bill to come. So essentially, just very quickly, there's 5 titles within the MSA discussion draft. So we're expecting the reauthorization bill to sort of follow in a similar path. And just to list them off really quickly, the first one is about climate ready fisheries. So again, promoting climate resilience and really addressing things like shifting fish stocks. The second title is supporting fishing communities. That includes issues like fishery resource disaster relief, working waterfronts grants that I mentioned in the working waterfronts bill, excuse me, and some money for marketing US seafood. And the third title is called Strengthening Public Process and Transparency. And that is essentially improving representation on the Regional Fishery Management Council level. And also improving some ethics and lobbying and financial conflict rules. Title 4 is modernizing fishery science and data. So that is things like expanding electronic monitoring and moving away from having an actual observer on a fishery deck. And some guidelines for improving recreational data. So again, it's making sure we're getting real-time, really good data in order to base that fishery science management decisions on. And the last is Title 5, which is sustaining fisheries through healthy ecosystems and improved management. So a lot of what's in that sort of section is improving protections for essential fish habitat areas of particular concern, and also some language specific to management of forage fish and improvements to some rebuilding plans. So there's a lot of really good stuff in there. The network submitted our comments. There's a few issues that we made suggestions for improvements, but overall, I would say this is a bill that we will be getting behind. And just a plug, if anybody really wants to get into in depth, Jared Huffman has some great resources available at huffman.house.gov/MSA, which stands for Magnuson-Stevens Act. So again, that's huffman.house.gov/MSA. And there's a lot of good summaries, one-pagers. You can listen to the listening tours in your region. So if you really want to get into the weeds of all this, really want to get fishy with it, you can go to this website.
Please don't repeat my bad jokes. I know we're a little bit over the time, so I understand if people have to leave, but we will take a couple more questions. One other, the pilot project that Melanie mentioned was summarized. We turned that collectively with those different aquariums into a guide on how to engage visitors on fisheries issues, and I put a link to that in the chat. So all of our kind of lessons learned, what worked well, what you might not want to do is in there too. So one, I guess, is another question for both of you, but we hear a lot in these conversations about there's a strong, like the policymakers don't often hear from regular people on these issues. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, like who are the dominant voices and why is it so important for policymakers to hear that constituents everyday folks who may not live and breathe fisheries also care about these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't mind me jumping in, Melanie, I'll be happy to take a stab at that. It's like any industry, any issue. There's a lot of money in fisheries and a lot of big money businesses. So that, oftentimes those are the strongest voices, are big industry players. And especially with people around the country, they think of the oceans when they go to the beach or they go to an aquarium or they go someplace, but in day to day, it may not be top of mind, that old saying, out of sight, out of mind. So really making sure that people are engaged on this issue, because when they are engaged, they really care a lot. So we want to make sure their voices are being heard. And I would say, it's crucial for people to make sure that that there are issues that they're close to. It may be that you don't understand how fisheries might affect you specifically, but you understand that the seafood you eat on your plate may or may not be there in the future. So there are some real issues that affect everyday people. And we want to make sure that people understand how something as wonky as federal fisheries policy does impact them, impacts their oceans, impacts coastal communities where they love to live and go visit and recreate and spend time. And so, yeah, I think it's just absolutely crucial that people hear from everyday folks.
Hey, Melanie, I understand that, when you all were starting this effort, there was some concern that you would hear angry comments or people would be upset. Did any of that, but none of that ever materialized, did it?
No, it didn't. We really didn't get any of that pushback as far as talking politics that we maybe anticipated a little bit. And just to piggyback off of what Joe was saying, we think it's important for our guests to have a voice and to feel like they can participate in even something as big as fisheries policy. And so we were happy to provide that platform for them to participate, where now we have 1,000 cards to send instead of just one person writing one letter. And our CEO is using that data as well. So for us, we thought that was great. We could combine the power of all of our guests, because we know they care a little because they came to us to see the animals that day. So they care a little bit. And so let's teach them while they're here and help them care a little more and participate.
One thing I want to give, before we close, I want to give Texas State Aquarium an extra shout out, because we were interested when we saw the data coming back that said, oh, well, we know that people who went to the dolphin presentation had a better experience than those who didn't, and that people who went to the dolphin presentation received the messaging about fisheries. They actually did a whole second set of exit surveys so that we could see that, okay, the dolphin presentation seemed to increase people's overall experience and also perceptions of the aquarium. The likelihood, that standard question many of you ask about, how likely would you be to refer the aquarium to a friend? That went up. It went up even higher when you talk to people about conservation fisheries policy. So just think about that. I mean, that was one of the things that you guys did, that extra effort, because it was a lot of work that you put in to do all those exit surveys. But then that data point was really critical, that we could actually disaggregate and show, no, talking to people about the fisheries policy actually bumped it up even further. And I will brag for Texas State, they already have an incredibly high net promoter score. So to get movements around those margins is not easy. So anyway, a little extra thank you for all the hard work you guys put in on that.
Yeah, I will second the kudos to that. It's amazing. It is amazing.
Yeah, well, listen, thank you all so much. I think that closes out the questions, and I want to be sensitive to the time. I know we've gone over, but I really appreciate the interest. I hope to see people back on May 1. I know these are still very, very tough times at aquariums and zoos across the country. And we're there to try to support and make efforts like this as easy as possible. So if there's anything that we can do to help in that regard, or any other topics that you'd like us to be covering in these webinars, please definitely reach out and let us know what you're thinking, and look at those tools we're providing. If things are working, let us know. If they're not, let us know. And thank you again to Joe and Melanie for joining us and sharing your expertise and experiences. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's great talking to you all.
All right, thank you very much. And until next month.